welcome to this, a chilling tale in our fairy tale collection for Halloween, and one you might have been wondering where it has been all this month. But here it is, the tale of BlueBeard. Now, as with many fairy tales that we know today, BlueBeard or La Barbe Bleue, I'm gonna butcher names and things in different languages. I apologise in advance. And the history of BlueBeard was originally just an oral tale, and it was first actually written down onto paper by the father of fairy tales, one Charles Perrault, in the year 1697, in his collection of tales titled Contes de ma mère l'oie, or Mother Goose Tales. And in this book were the classic fairy tales, the original fairy tales, and alongside the horror of BlueBeard were the first written versions of the tales we now know and love, such as The Sleeping Beauty, Little Red Riding Hood, Puss in Boots, and Cinderella. Now, if you want to skip the history lesson, click to the timing up there to go direct to where we start the story. Now, unlike the wholesome tales previously mentioned, BlueBeard stands alone, under a far darker aspect. Now, there is a lot of belief that because of its horrific nature, it is actually a Brothers Grimm tale, as their tales tend to lean more towards the horror and violent aspects, which a lot of people now love. But as with other fairy tales, the Brothers Grimm had their own version of BlueBeard, which is styled after this one. And their version is the likes of Fitcher's Bird, The Robber Bridegroom, and The White Dove. Even Charles Dickens got in on the retelling of this tale, with his own version being Captain Murderer. Link up there because we've already covered this one. But none of these listed hold a candle to the diabolical acts of this first horror fairy tale, of a man who first marries and then murders every wife he has, which has successfully scarred children for centuries, and could be deemed to be the conduit for the imaginations of the horror writers we now know and love today. For example, and it's the only example I have, in Stephen King's The Shining, the child character of Danny knows that he can go in any room in the Overlook Hotel anywhere he likes, except for one, room 217. And King does a fabulous job of what being told that at any age you can go anywhere but that particular place, what that does to the psyche, being that ends up being the only place that you can think of going, usually ending with absolutely disastrous results. And while we're on the subject, I do have some more examples, albeit Disney ones. In The Lion King, Mufasa tells Simba that he can go anywhere the light touches, except for the dark, shadowy place being the elephant graveyard. And what does the little lion cub do at the first chance he gets? He goes there, with disastrous results. And this also comes up in Beauty and the Beast, being that Belle can go anywhere in the castle, the whole castle is open to her, except the West Wing. She's not to go in there, she's not to ask about it, she is completely forbidden. And at the first chance she gets, where does she go? Straight into there. Now, one thing that people might not know is that Charles Perrault and the people around France who repeated this tale orally were taking it from a real source. Yes, you heard that right. BlueBeard is actually attributed to being a real person. Not a ghouly monster in the literal sense, but something even worse. A flesh and blood human being. And most of the time they are the worst type of monsters. Someone who lived, who breathed, who was a 15th century convicted serial killer by the name of Gilles de Rais. Now, this assumption is controversial in some circles, but for me there are way too many similarities for it to be just fobbed off. He dabbled in the occult, specifically alchemy and demon summoning, which is what led to his notoriety and not his outstanding military career as a French baron. And as no demon was forthcoming, he grew angry with his advisors, and they told him that the demon was angry and required the offering of parts of a child. In his own confession, Gilles testified that when the said children were dead, he kissed them, and those who had the most handsome limbs and heads he held up to admire them, and had their bodies cruelly cut open, and took delight at the sight of their inner organs. And very often, when the children were dying, He sat on their stomachs and took pleasure in seeing them die, and laughed as they did. His crimes against children in his castle were so lurid that the judges at the time ordered them to be struck from the record. And this was the 1400s. People's idea of a grand day out was to watch a hanging or the torture of a criminal, and I won't even get into what they did to each other when wars broke out. He was hanged for his crimes on the 26th of October 1440, 583 years to the day that this video goes live. But Gilles de Rais is not the only possible source for this tale, although it's the one I lean more towards, because the other is a medieval ruler of Brittany whose history was written 5 centuries after his death, so not the most reliable source. This story goes that King Conomor the Accursed married his wife Tryphene, but she was warned by the ghosts of his previous wives that Conomor murders his wives as soon as they become pregnant. So when she becomes with child, she flees, but he catches her and beheads her. But St. Gildas restores her to life, and when she returns home, Conomor's castle collapses on him, killing him. But with these two tales intertwined, could be the birthplace of BlueBeard, and thus spawned the horror fairy tale that spawned them all. And that horror was felt at the time of its publication. It was so different to other fairy tales that people had become accustomed to at the time, such as Cinderella and Sleeping Beauty. And for some folklorists at the time and since, they conclude that the tale of BlueBeard can only be considered a fairy tale for one specific aspect, that aspect being the magic key. And if it wasn't for that, BlueBeard would be relegated to just being a murderous, monstrous horror story. And don't we like them the most? Now we sit in 2023, the modern digital age. The entire globe is available at the flick of a switch, some 326 years after BlueBeard's first publication. And we are exposed on a daily basis to some of the worst horror that the human race can dream up, and it is all at our fingertips. From books, movies, games, the news, we have the best that the horror genre has to offer. Whether it be psychological, graphic, slasher, paranormal, body horror, good old-fashioned monsters, or just Watership Down. But it is still BlueBeard that most adults refer to when discussing the stories that really scared them, the ones that really stuck with them. So, this Halloween, gather yourselves and your children round for the murderous tale of BlueBeard. Pick up the key, turn it in the lock, open the door, and follow me. There was once a man who owned many fine houses, both in town and in the country. His treasury was overflowing with gold, silver, and jewels of all kinds. The furniture in all these houses was embroidered with gold, and all his carriages was gilded with pure gold. Unfortunately, this man was unlucky. He had a long blue beard, which made him so frightfully ugly looking that all the women and girls ran away from him in fear. Now, one of his neighbours was a widow who had 2 beautiful daughters. BlueBeard told her that he desired one of them in marriage, he didn't care which, and left the choice up to the mother as to which one would be his bride. However, neither girl would have him. They sent him back and forth from one to the other, as neither could bear the thought of having to marry a man with such a frightfully awful blue beard. Now, adding to their disgust was the well-known fact that BlueBeard had already been married several times, and nobody knew what had happened to his wives. They had simply disappeared. Now, in order to engage their affections, BlueBeard invited them both, along with their mother and a group of their society friends, to spend the weekend with him at one of his large country houses. The whole time was spent with parties, hunting, fishing, dancing, feasting and mirth, and nobody ever wanted to go to bed as they would miss out on such a wonderful time. Everything succeeded so well that the youngest daughter began to think that being married to this charismatic, worldly man wouldn't be such a bad thing after all, and the simple colour of his beard could be well overlooked. Now, as soon as the weekend was over and everybody had returned home, the wedding between BlueBeard and the youngest daughter was eventually held. Now, about a month after their wedding, BlueBeard went to his new wife and said that he had to go on a journey for around 6 weeks at least to conclude some business affairs of some very great consequence, but that she was not to miss him too much and she was to make good cheer with whatever she did. "Here," said he, "are the keys to the 2 great wardrobes wherein I have my best furniture. These are to my silver and gold plate, which is not every day in use. These open my strong boxes which hold my money, both gold and silver. These my caskets of jewels. And this is the master key to all my apartments. But as for this little one here, it is the key to the closet at the end of the great hall on the ground floor. Open them all, go into each and every one of them, except that little closet, which I forbid you. And forbid it in such a manner that if you happen to open it, you may expect my just anger and resentment." His young wife promised him faithfully that she would do what he had ordered, and BlueBeard embraced her, climbed into one of the golden coaches, and proceeded on his journey. Now her very curious and gossipy neighbours did not want to wait to be sent for by the newly married lady. They were extremely impatient to see all the riches that were in her house, and they dared not venture near when BlueBeard was home because of his such a frightening and horrific aspect. They ran through every room, exclaiming at all the richness of it. They could not sufficiently admire the number of wonderful tapestries, beds, couches, cabinets, stands, tables, and looking-glasses, in which you might see yourself from head to toe. Some of them were framed with glass, some of them with gilded silver and gold, and everything was the finest and most magnificent that any of them had ever encountered before. They tried in vain to divert their friend into looking at all of these rich things which were now hers by marriage. But the one thing the new wife wanted to see was the little closet at the end of the hall on the ground floor. She was so absorbed in her growing curiosity that although it was socially rude to abandon her guests, she slipped away from them all the same. And she ran down the back staircase with such haste that she nearly fell and broke her neck. Now she stopped and stood in front of the little closet door with the key in hand, staring at it for some time. She kept thinking of her husband's strict orders, and considering who her husband was, she thought desperately of what unhappiness would befall her if she went against his strict commands. But the temptation of the locked door and what secrets lay behind it proved far too much to be able to bear. She took hold of the little key, inserted it in the lock of the door, and turned it. At first, she could not see anything. The windows were shut, and the room was incredibly dark. After some moments, her eyes began to adjust. The floor was covered with a dark, viscous substance. Clotted blood with chunks of body parts and clumps of hair covered the stone floor. Horrified, the young wife looked to the far end of the room, and she saw several mutilated bodies of young women stacked against the walls, all in varying degrees of decomposition. Some had even been disemboweled, and some had had their heads severed at the neck. These were all the previous wives of BlueBeard, whom he had married and then callously tortured and murdered. She thought that she would just die on the spot from fear, and the key to the room fell from her hand and landed in the clotted blood. After recovering from her initial shock, she now was terrified on how to survive. She picked up the key, relocked the door, and retired to her chambers in order to recover her senses. But she was too frightened to even think straight. Now, once back in her chambers, she saw that the little key to the closet door was covered in blood, and she tried 2 or 3 times to wipe it off, but to no avail. In vain she tried to wash it, and even scrub it with soap and sand, but the blood remained, because the key was magical, and she could never make it quite clean. Now, unsurprisingly, BlueBeard arrived home unexpectedly that very same night, saying that he had received 2 letters while on the road, informing him that his business had concluded to his advantage and he was no longer needed. And his young wife did everything she could to convince him that she was extremely happy to see him back so soon. The next morning, BlueBeard asked his young wife for return of the keys, which she duly handed over. but her hand was trembling so much that BlueBeard easily guessed at what she had done in his absence. And BlueBeard asked her why the little key was not included on the rings with the rest of them, and she told him that she must have just left it on the table up the stairs. "Fail not," said BlueBeard, "to bring it to me at once." After several tries and attempts at not to complete this task, his wife was forced to bring him the little key. BlueBeard took it from her and looked at it very, very carefully, and he turned to her and asked her in a dangerous voice, "Why is there blood on this key?" "I do not know," cried the poor woman, paler than death. "You do not know," replied BlueBeard. "I very well know. You went into the closet, did you not? Very well, madam, you shall go back and take your place among the ladies you saw there." Upon this she threw herself at her husband's feet and begged his pardon with all the signs of a true repentance, vowing that she would never more be disobedient. She would have melted a rock, so beautiful and sorrowful was she, but BlueBeard had a heart harder than any rock. "You must die, madam," said he, "at once." "Since I must die," answered she, looking upon him with her eyes all bathed in tears, "give me some little time to say my prayers." "I give you," replied BlueBeard, "half a quarter of an hour, but not 1 moment more." When she was left alone, she called out to her elder sister Anne to run to the top of the tower and look to see if their brothers were coming, as they had promised to pay her a visit today, and if she saw them she was to give them a sign to make haste. Her sister ran as fast as her skirts would allow up the winding staircase, and the poor wife called to her desperately. Did she see anything? Anne called down that she could see nothing but a cloud of dust in the sun and the green grass. Meanwhile, BlueBeard unsheathed his sharp sword, shouted to his wife, "Come down instantly, or I shall come up to you." His wife called down that she required a moment more, and cried up to her sister softly, "Please, Anne, do you see anyone coming?" Her sister answered again that she could see nothing but a cloud of dust in the sun and the green grass. "Come down quickly," cried BlueBeard, "or I will come up to you." "I am coming," answered his wife, and then she cried, "Anne, Sister Anne, do you not see anyone coming?" "I see," replied Sister Anne, "a great cloud of dust approaching us." "Are they my brothers?" "Alas, no, my dear sister. I see a flock of sheep." "Will you not come down?" cried BlueBeard. "1 moment longer," said his wife, and then she cried out, "Anne, Sister Anne, do you see nobody coming?" "I see," said she, "2 horsemen, but they are still a great way off." "God be praised," replied the poor wife joyfully. "They are my brothers. I will make them a sign as well as I can for them to make haste." BlueBeard bellowed so loud that the whole house trembled at his voice. His distressed wife descended and threw herself at his feet, tears running down her face with her hair flowing around her shoulders. "This means nothing. You must die," BlueBeard menacingly said to her. Then he grabbed a fistful of her hair, lifting her head up to face him, and lifting up his sharp sword with the other, he prepared to decapitate her. His wife begged him that if he had ever loved her, to afford her 1 little moment to collect herself. "Commend yourself to God," was all her loving husband replied. At this instant there was such a hammering at the gate that BlueBeard made a sudden stop. The gate was flung open and 2 horsemen entered. Drawing their swords, they ran directly to BlueBeard. He knew them to be his wife's brothers, one a dragoon, the other a musketeer, so that he ran away immediately to save himself, but the 2 brothers pursued and overtook him before he could get to the steps of the porch. Then they ran their swords through his body and left him for dead, his life-blood pouring out and flowing over the stone steps like a waterfall. The poor wife was almost as dead as her husband, and had not strength enough to rise and welcome her brothers. BlueBeard had no heirs, and so his young wife became mistress of all his estate. She made use of one part of it to marry her sister Anne to a young gentleman who had loved her a long while, another to buy captain's commissions for her brothers, and the rest to marry herself to a very worthy gentleman, who she loved, and who made her forget the ill time she had passed with her first husband with a blue beard. And so ends the tale of BlueBeard. Let me know what you think of this tale and its gruesome history down in the comments section below. And don't forget to give me a like, click that subscribe button, and have a wonderfully happy, spooky Halloween.